the polls have actually been quite mixed. There was only a poll yesterday that suggested that Rishi Sunak was just 5 points behind Liz Truss. There was a poll done a few days ago on Tory councillors, and it showed them basically neck and neck. There have been other polls showing that Rishi Sunak would be most likely to win back voters in Conservative seats that we won in 2019. So my view is it's never over until it's over. There's a good few weeks to go. Members are still waiting to see the candidates at the hustings and the TV debates and read what they say in the press. So I think it's still all to play for.
And let's turn to the policy of this race now, because that is really what has been focused in on over the course of this campaign, more so than previous leadership campaigns, perhaps. A really policy-focused fight. And yesterday, the Liz Truss campaign came under a lot of heavy fire from the Rishi Sunak campaign and indeed from the Labour Party over this issue of regional pay boards. Does the Rishi Sunak campaign therefore think that the level of pay that is currently divvied out across the public sector is the right one?
Well, what I think it shows is that it's actually much harder to cut public spending than it looks. And it's important not just to kind of suggest every day that there's going to be bread from heaven pouring down on the public, and that there'll be easy public spending cut decisions, easy tax cut decisions, especially when we have debt of £2 trillion, debt of interest on the debt this year alone over £80 billion. And I think what happened yesterday was it showed that when you make these kind of public spending policies, it's actually much harder than it looks. And that would have hit the policy proposed by the Truss campaign, would have hit workers in disadvantaged areas, particularly in the north of England and in constituencies like mine. And if anything, we should be looking at paying public sector workers in disadvantaged areas a little bit more if that's possible, because we know, for example, teachers and support staff, it's very hard. It's hard to find to recruit teachers. It's hard to get them to teach in disadvantaged areas, and those areas have big recruitment problems.
Well, let's have a look, a little graph from the Institute for Fiscal Studies now. This shows the differential between public and private sector pay. And you can see that in the southeast, in London, and indeed in your region, the east of England, the public sector is actually paid less than the private sector. But in every other region of the country, the public sector is paid more than equivalent jobs in the private sector, up to 10% more if you are in the public sector, if you're funded by taxes. Is that fair?
Well, I think, look, that is a much wider argument. And of course, there always need to be a look at public sector pay, especially when we have huge debt and inflation and the things that I mentioned earlier. But that is totally different from what the Truss campaign was suggesting, would be that you'd have, in essence, significant pay disparities, and often in areas where you most need those public sector workers.
Well, let's turn now to what the Rishi Sunak campaign has been accused of doing by the Liz Truss campaign. The idea of U-turns over VAT, over the level of taxation, over Rwanda, over the Northern Ireland Protocol bill. What does the Rishi Sunak campaign say in response to this sort of charge sheet of U-turns?
Well, I think that's nonsense. If you look at the income tax proposal, that takes place over a number of years. The Truss campaign is proposing to spend £50 billion. And where are we going to get that money from? I mentioned the £80 billion of debt interest we have to pay. What happens if there is another crisis, for example, and we need to spend more money and borrow more money? What happens to spending on the National Health Service? Where do we get the £30 billion that both leadership candidates, agree needs to be spent over the next few years in order to pay for the backlog and for social care. But Rishi's plans for income tax are over a number of years. They're carefully set out and costed, and won't have the potential of increasing the national debt or increasing inflation, which of course we know is one of the biggest enemies of the cost of living. You might say that what the proposals from the other campaign might do. In fact, their own economic advisor said the spending proposals will possibly increase interest rates up to over 7%. I mean, that would crush homeowners across the country and be a lot more expensive. They'd be paying thousands more rather than possibly saving a few hundred more in immediate tax cuts.